This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Today, we continue our series of special episodes for this election year. We've been looking at some of the usual rhythms of an election cycle and some of the most interesting and forgotten history around them. So we've talked about conventions, we've talked about debates, we've talked about vice presidential picks, the Veep stakes, and today we're going to talk about October surprises. So we'll try and define exactly what we mean in this episode, and then we will go through some of the more interesting examples. But basically, these are stories that upend or reshape an election right up at the last moment of the election cycle. So welcome to October Surprise Week. And here, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And also here, not as always, perhaps those of you listening at home can tell, we have a live audience. We are taping this in Boston at WBUR's CitySpace. Our friends at Radiotopia helped us put this show on, and it is really nice to be gathered together for this. So hello, Boston. Thank you for joining us this evening. And since it is Boston, we knew we had to get a special guest. Joining us here on stage is the one and only Josh Gondelman, Boston native, repeat guest on the show, was a writer for Desus and Mero, Last Week Tonight. His book is called Nice Try, and you hear him a lot on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me these days. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you so much for having me, everybody. Oh, it's what a pleasure to be here. This episode is about October surprises, these events that reshape, upend, kind of provide a big twist into an election cycle. And I was thinking about the last couple election cycles, which I felt very upenddy and twisty. And so I actually wanted to just start by showing you and the audience here a list of the surprises that I just, off the top of my head, came up with from 2016 to 2024 that feel like October surprises. So, the WikiLeaks, the basket of deplorables comment, the protest in 2020, Trump holds a rally where then Herman Cain gets COVID.
Oh, yeah.
Guys, remember that?
Not good.
Rest in peace.
The Trump assassination attempts from this year, Joe Biden dropping out. These are all feel very October surprisey, except none of them happened in October. And so maybe not to completely undermine the premise of this, but one of the things that I want to explore as we do this is that, everything feels like an October surprise these days.
True.
Have thoughts on that?
Well, I think that it speaks to how up in the air everything is and how quickly everything can change in a way that I was talking to my students the other day about this. It didn't used to be like this.
Yeah.
Like it used to be that elections would happen and sometimes something interesting would happen, but it didn't consume you because there wasn't always like breaking news about the election for months. And I think this year has been kind of the distillation of that. I mean, just the debate, the assassination attempt, Biden dropping out, Harris coming in. Like, it's just been one of the wildest general elections I think we've ever seen. For an election that was supposed to be just a boring old repeat of the 2020 election.
Yeah. The whiplash has been insane because I remember all of us texting during Trump's assassination attempt. And then, was it like a week later where Biden dropped out?
Yeah.
I feel it wasn't a lot of time. And it was like
it was like the RNC was like 4 days later, and then 3 days after that.
But a week felt like old news, Like I was like, how have we moved on so quickly? It's been a lot.
Well, Josh, what is your sense? I mean, this is going to be one of the big through lines today. I mean, frankly, it's one of the big through lines in kind of how I understand the world. But it's like, how much of it is attention and how much of it is the news is actually that crazy?
I mean, the news has been really wild, but I think the thing about an October surprise being in October, right? Like the reason we label it that way is like the same as the logic behind it's always the last place you look.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we call it an October surprise because October is the last point where there can kind of be surprises for the most part.
Yeah.
And so that I think that's part of it, right? And so I do think the news has been extra hectic. We've had a fairly, I don't mean to cast any aspersions against our former president, but I do think we've had kind of a chaotic element in the last 3 elections.
Yeah.
Kind of.
And so, we'll get to the history.
Not to impugn his good name,
Right.
he's a little erratic.
The horse in the hospital. But to think that, if history, we'll go through the history, but if history teaches us anything, that, 3 weeks from now we hit October and there will probably be some surprises.
Yeah, wait for that.
We've been through this and there are still shoes. Yeah, how many shoes is this thing wearing?
We're taking off
They
clothes.
keep dropping.
Whole
Yeah.
closet.
So, okay, let's get into a little bit of the history. In a second, we'll go through a kind of like taxonomy of how we can categorize October surprises. But there is actually an interesting history that we can kind of trace to the phrase itself. So, NIki, what's your sense of where that phrase comes from?
Like so much of modern politics, this phrase was gifted to us by Ronald Reagan. So the 1980 election, those of you who remember or who have spent some time studying this period know that the big thing that was hanging over the election was the Iran hostage crisis, which had dragged out at that point for over a year. And it was something that was really helping the Reagan campaign because the Carter administration just looked inept, because they couldn't bring this crisis to a close. And the Reagan campaign was really worried that they were going to bring this crisis to a close right before the election, and that was going to tip the election in Carter's favor. So they start whispering to the press about a possible October surprise. And the reason that they're doing this is because if this happens, if the hostages are freed right before the election, they want journalists to write about it as, oh, this is a political ploy rather than a triumphant diplomatic negotiation by the Carter administration.
So we get the phrase. I mean, I've been trying to get my head around this all day because of knowing what ends up happening, which we will get to. But that the phrase was injected into the discourse as a kind of like counter move. They like invented the phrase to then undermine it or something.
It was like a prophylactic phrase, right? But he invented the phrase for a thing that hadn't happened.
Yeah.
And didn't happen.
Yeah.
What's that?
And didn't happen.
And didn't happen. Right.
Yeah.
He invented the phrase for a thing to stop it from happening. It was like magic words.
Yeah.
And so it did put the press on notice, I think, and a big part of this is, as we'll go through, how much of it is the sort of media attention and then voter attention.
And that really is kind of like the slimy part of like electoral politics, right? Where like Ronald Reagan came out and was like, God, it would suck if those American hostages were brought home, right?
Yeah.
Hope that doesn't happen.
There is sliminess throughout this evening. And so that's good. They're good that you bring that up because here's how we're gonna do it. We're gonna, as we've often done in the first episode of these series, we've tried to kind of get our head around the basic categories and basically just do like a review, and so we'll rip through a bunch of stories. We can stop, linger on some, but then we'll do some follow-up episodes maybe on the ones that seem a little more interesting. But as we go through, I think we found that you can kind of put October surprises into a few different categories. And so it'll be useful to go through these categories, and each of us is going to take the lead on some of these categories. So the basic categories of October surprises, there's some overlap here and there, but the first one is stuff that candidates say, right? So someone says something late in the election, it causes a stir. There's stuff that the press digs up. A lot of times it's news that pops out at the last minute. There's stuff that happens in the world. A lot of this is foreign events, which can't necessarily be anticipated or controlled, and they will upend an election. And then there's rat fucking. Basically, shenanigans.
Shenanigans. Shady shit.
That's like
the Boston version of it.
The radio edit of rat fucking from Henry Kissinger's single. So they could play it on Jammin' 94.5.
But, and I will say this last category really just actually, there's an argument to be made that it's all shady shenanigans, and it really kind of weaves throughout. But we will try and roughly break it up into these basic groups as we go through. And then, I think some of the big questions that we'll sort of explore and tease and get around to at the end is how much of these matter? Do they have an actual impact on election returns? And then how much of it is it that it's happening in that sort of compressed window? But I think there's a long history of this stuff going back, we should say, way further than the term existed, right? And so let's start in with stuff that candidates say, or gaffes or stuff like that. So, NIki, where do we want to start?
So one place to start is with candidates saying things, or their surrogates saying things that really alienate voters. This is something we now see on, I think, a daily basis in the campaign. It used
Sometimes
to be
intentionally.
Yeah, I know.
Used to be a little more rare. The childless cat lady moments were sprinkled out across an election cycle.
Strategy.
Used to be a bad thing.
Yeah.
And of course, when you think about Republican nominees who say something really offensive to drive away voters, of course, we all think of the same person, James Blaine. I know,
you're like
1884. We're all thinking about that election where James Blaine is the Republican candidate, and he goes to one of these Republican meetings, and there is a preacher there who is talking about what's wrong with the Democratic Party. And what's wrong with the Democratic Party, he says, is that it is the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Great alliteration. Not necessarily as scrutable to a modern audience as it was then, but the idea was that the Democratic Party is basically made up of people who oppose prohibition, Catholics, and supporters of the Confederacy. And in saying this, Blaine is out of
Josh is like, dude.
Yeah. Some of that sounds pretty sick. And then you get to the Confederacy, and it's like,
they weren't wrong. It wasn't an inaccurate description, but that for the first 2/3 of it was really aimed at new immigrants and at Catholics. And so that turned off a lot of Democratic voters. It angered a lot of Democratic voters. And what you see is a real outcry against Blaine. Now, Blaine wasn't the one who made the comments.
Right.
There's a little bit of a Reverend Wright thing about this. Like a preacher said something.
Oh, interesting.
And everybody starts
You
yelling
just
at the
sat there
candidate.
and nodded along, and
That's right.
bad
He was
enough.
just like,
Right.
I was just in the pews. What do you want from me?
Complicit.
But he also doesn't denounce him. And so this becomes, in the last weeks of the campaign, you have particularly Irish immigrants in New York who are kind of on both the rum and Romanism side of things, really angry and organizing against Blaine. And the result of all of this is, in a very, very close election, Grover Cleveland, the Democratic candidate, wins by 0.5%. And so I know we'll talk later about whether or not October surprises matter, but in a very close election like that, everything matters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so this comment may have been what put the only Democratic president into office between the Civil War and 1912.
Wow. Turnout that year, by the way, was 78% election turnout.
what else were they doing?
78%.
Yeah, I know.
It's wild.
That's such a tough. Back in the day, it feels like an October surprise was trickier because, how do you even let people know?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, he said this thing about rum and Romanism. How long is that game of telephone?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that. The press, how long does it take to circulate by wagon?
Right.
What happened?
But the flip side, I think about this too, but the flip side to that is that what else are people going to do but sit around and talk about that?
That's right.
All day.
Also, the
and
Telegraph
read incredibly
existed.
long newspaper
Oh, the
articles.
Telegraph. Okay,
The
yeah.
Telegraph.
Telegraph.
And it's
Twitter.
an era of party papers. And so people subscribe to the newspaper of their parties. So you bet the, Charlotte Democrat was sending around this in every paper from the moment they got it till the election.
Yeah.
That's such a sick quote that the alliteration hits even as boop, 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 boop. 3 hours. I get it.
It's pretty clear to everyone by now that social media has changed everything from the way we live to how we discuss politics and what we think we know about the world around us. Which begs the question, who's in charge here? Hi, I'm Jon Favreau, former Obama speechwriter turned chronically online host of Offline with Jon Favreau. Join me every week just outside your social media-fueled echo chamber for a smarter, lighter conversation about the real-time changes and real-world effects of social media and the internet on all of our lives. Check out Offline with Jon Favreau every Sunday wherever you get your podcasts.
We want to tell you about another podcast from PRX called Monumental. This podcast explores questions about the past, present, and future of U.S. monuments, uncovering the stories about what and who is important, as well as the stories that have been left out. Join host Ashley Seaford across the country with their team of journalists. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Our next thing a candidate said or didn't say.
So the next thing, the question of an October surprise, that is the gun that didn't go off. So the thing that the candidate doesn't say in the run-up to the election, you kind of get the surprise later. And in the case of the 1916 election, the surprise comes about 6 months later because Woodrow Wilson runs as the president who kept us out of war. And that was a really great line to run on because Americans really wanted to stay out of the war that was unfolding in Europe at the time. And Wilson really wanted to win re-election because he's now the second Democrat to win office since the Civil War. He won in a crazy race in 1912 where the Republicans were divided and he snuck his way into the White House. And so he wants to hold on to the White House. And so he's not going to say, well, we're probably going to go to war with Europe in a few months. So the October surprise is the president kept us out of war. The April surprise is mass mobilization and world war.
Jacob, who helps do the preps and research for this, his bullet points under this were basically like, Wilson says he's going to keep us out of war. Wilson wins the election very closely. Next April, we declare war. But the U.S. does declare war on Germany, April 1917. There was also this other subplot in this election where Hughes, the person that Wilson was running against, but all of you knew that, was in California and snubbed the governor of California, and people were very offended by that. And California, I guess, was the really critical state in the 1916 election, both on the anti-war question and apparently on this "you snubbed our governor" question. And it ended up being the decisive state.
And there is a corollary where somebody actually does say something in the run-up to the election, and that's in 1972. Again, in this case, the U.S. was involved in a war that was very unpopular, and in this race against Richard Nixon and George McGovern, Henry Kissinger comes out and says, peace is at hand, right? Victory is right around the corner. And by 1972, not everyone believes.
Those of you who were around in fall of 72, did it feel like peace was at hand?
Kissinger tells you something about war, you listen. He's a straight shooter.
Man knows his way around a war.
Man. 2.5 years later.
Yeah, exactly. Remarkable. Are there people here who remember Kissinger saying that in 72? Yeah. My parents are here, by the way. They remember that. We will get into other Vietnam War shenanigans later, for sure. You want to talk about the 2008?
I do want to talk about 2008, which is maybe actually 2012.
2012,
which is
of course.
when Barack Obama was running against Mitt Romney. And they had already set up that campaign to be about populist economics. The first campaign speech that Barack Obama gave in Osawatomie, Kansas, was about making a fairer economy. And the good Lord could not have delivered him a better person to run against than a venture capitalist and the guy who had detailed plans to cut Social Security and Medicare. But so he's running against Mitt Romney and
former
Paul Ryan.
Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney.
I know.
Weird facts.
Fun fact.
And so it's not quite in October, but it's in mid-September when somebody releases a tape of Romney's comments to donors about the 47%. And we did a really great episode with David Korn on this. I think, did David break the story?
He broke the story, yeah.
Yeah. But you'll probably remember this quote, right? That there are 47% of the people who will vote for Barack Obama no matter what, who are dependent on the government, who believe that they are the victims. My job is not to worry about those people. I will never convince them they should take personal responsibility and care for their lives.
Yeah.
Again, not a great way to win people over by writing them off. And I do think, that election, we thought it was closer than it actually turned out to be. But because that really reinforced the core argument of the Obama campaign versus Romney and Ryan, I feel like that one had a real punch.
Do you remember, I think I said this when we were recording the podcast, that I was voting in Dorchester. At the time I lived in Dorchester. And when I showed up to the poll, a man said, the 47% is here. The 47% is here to vote. And I was like, oh, it's not going to look good for you. Like, Gaff, did you win?
Yeah. Do you have memories of that moment or thoughts on that,
I do.
Josh?
I mean, I remember that. And because it did feel like kind of a landslide from that, like from that point onward.
Right.
I remember like the election coverage, Karl Rove like stumbling around, like trying to explain it on TV, and it, which was delightful just to watch him under stress. But yeah, that was a real heavy one. And the thing about it was the viciousness and dismissiveness, right? Because if he had just been like, look, a bunch of people are going to vote for the Democratic candidate for president in 2012, right? And like, I'm probably not going to chip away at that. That's like not a controversial thing, but it was so like disgusting the way he expressed it. It was just like the people who vote for Democrats, people who have no agency in their own life and refuse to accept it. Like,
yeah, and it fit into the whole makers and takers theme that had emerged that year. It was dismissive, but it was not childless cat ladies. I mean, it was a conservative viewpoint.
Yeah.
What made it particularly smarmy, I think, was that it was delivered to a room of ultra-rich donors. And I think if you remember and David Korn talked about this on the show, but the other stuff that was in that tape too, there was just a disconnect between stuff he was clearly saying in a room to donors and stuff he was saying on that. And I think that, as much as anything, hit people the wrong way of just like, this is how these people talk in private.
a big problem with Republican policy is like when people hear what it is.
No.
It's a real hard thing for
This man on CNN. Trenchant political analysis.
Yeah. When people hear what they mean, people are like, ugh.
But, look, we did an episode on this. I'm, really fascinated by this moment. I think about the basket of deplorables comment from Hillary Clinton, which, I will die on the hill that, like, that was, like, really taken out of context and spun and just a really, because she was doing a sort of similar thing rhetorically to what Romney is doing here, which is saying, look, we live in a country where, like, this group of people is just, we're not going to reach them and this group of people. And then there is this group of people, and, Clinton did this very explicitly. Romney doesn't do it as much, but, Clinton very explicitly says, like, our job is to reach all those other people who are still have an R next to who they vote for, but they're still Americans and we need to bring them in. And so, there's a little of that going on in this comment from Romney. And moreover, I think when I think back to the 2012 election, I really do feel like it was the last election that was kind of run on like a real difference of political viewpoint, and it was like, and it was actually, and it kind of was nicely summed up by the two sort of twisted rhetorical scandals, which was Obama saying you didn't build that, and Romney saying dismissing the 47%, which if you take half a step back from the kind of scandal of the rhetoric, actually do sort of express a Democratic and Republican viewpoint on the economy, and that's what that election sort of played out to be about. Any other thoughts? Do you want to talk about how that tape kind of came out into the world? So it made its way to David Korn, but it was a bartender who recorded it.
Bartender who's in this room full of fat cats, and he's listening to this, and he's like, oh, okay. I might just like set my phone up here, make a little recording.
Not a phone, though. It was pre-phone, so it was an actual little mini cam.
And then holds on to it because he understands what an October surprise is.
Because he said it in May. Romney
right.
says this in May.
Yeah. So he's like, let's release this when it matters. And that's how it comes out in September.
There's a real lesson there, I think, which is tip your bartender.
Actually.
David Korn made a very good point. I went back and listened to that episode today. He made a very good point that the thing that did was obviously it reinforced a narrative that was already out there. So, that cuts both ways. Like, the scandals that reinforce an existing narrative are very powerful, but also it's like we didn't necessarily need an extra piece of evidence that this is Romney's worldview. But what it did do was it caused the Romney campaign. That was like the lead news item for 2 whole weeks. And every hour is precious when you get to October. And that they were putting out that fire for 2 weeks, I think, is as much the impact as anything on that. All right, let's move to stuff that the press digs up. So, this was a nice segue because that was a sort of media story. But Kellie, where do you want to start with this?
You gave me all the juicy ones.
Oh, yeah?
Really? So, okay, I'm going to take you back to the 19th century, too. We're going to go back to 1844. James K. Polk is running against Henry Clay. These are 2 slaveholders, and they're sort of going tit for tat. And the rumor that gets started about James K. Polk is, you might be a slaveholder, but you're not a very good one. You brand your slaves. And that was considered fighting words. Now, again, I feel like I have to say this. There's no such thing as a good slaveholder. there's no such thing as
Bold
a kind
statement.
master, but again, trying to put that extra rub there. The problem is not that you're a slaveholder. The problem is how you handle your enslaved property. And this idea that he was branding his enslaved property really stuck with Polk and really sort of becomes this moment in which people are thinking about what kind of person they want to vote for. And it's, again, not about slavery, but if he's that violent, if he's that brutal, does he get my vote? They didn't call it the October surprise back then. They called it roarbacking.
Roarbacking. So the story here is that this abolitionist newspaper publishes this rumor about Polk branding his slaves, and it's reportedly taken from a book called Roarback's Tour Through the Southern and Western States in the Year 1836, so some travelogue. But before the term October Surprise existed, we had roarbacking or roarbacking.
I like October Surprise better.
You like roarbacking.
Rolls off the tongue a little easier.
I know, maybe.
Apparently, roarbacking was the term for a sort of rumor or undermining of a candidate late in. It didn't really stick.
Yeah, no, and that's okay. So we're going to go into the 20th century.
You want to go to the 20th century?
Into the 20th century. And this is George Bush's DUI. So about 24 years earlier, George Bush is about 30 years old. He gets pulled over for drunk driving. He gets a DUI. He's arrested. And it kind of gets swept under the rug. Nobody really talks about this. And in the month of October, all of a sudden, this story comes back into the news. George Bush has a DUI. He was drunk driving in Maine. This sets a bad example. Bush is pissed for a lot of reasons. He suspects that this is, Gore's doing. And interestingly, Gore kind of he doesn't really harp on that opportunity.
Yeah.
He probably could have done that, but he sort of sidesteps it a little bit. But that also stayed in the news for a big while. I mean, people don't think of George Bush as an alcoholic, but he definitely struggles with alcoholism, which is the reason he doesn't, drink now. But it felt like a really shady thing to do right on the cusp of the election, to bring up his past.
There's a couple things there. I mean, one of them is, gosh, remember when a DUI was a big political scandal?
Yeah, I know. I know.
We had one of those in this election.
Right.
And people were like, he seems nice.
I know.
Wait, we did?
You mentioned that. Yeah.
Tim Walz had a DUI in the 1990s.
That did not make it across
His
my
mugshots
transom.
all over the internet.
Yeah.
Nobody
I missed
cares
that.
at all.
Right, you guys are in
Truly.
deep.
People were like,
Here's a mugshot.
he probably didn't mean it.
But also, I looked
Tim
at
had a beard.
his mugshot, and I was like, oh, he's kind of cute.
Okay, this is useless for the podcast listeners, and it's going to sound arrogant after what you just said. The mugshot looks like, people on the internet were like, why does the mugshot look exactly like you, Josh Gondelman? It is like big round face, baseball cap. It was very funny.
But I actually think one of the reasons why the Bush one and the Walz one don't necessarily stick is because both men got sober after.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
redemption story
For
in
sure.
there. That
It felt like
kind
a real dig.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, listen, this is a person that's trying to be sober. We don't need to punch down. It kind of felt like that. So it doesn't, it has a moment, but it probably didn't have the same sort of punch it would have if we thought of him as someone with a real problem or current problem.
But what if it would have changed 538 votes in Florida?
Well, funny enough,
For just the Supreme Court. It's only 9.
funny enough, Karl Rove at some point gave an interview and claimed that this rumor probably cost Bush 5 states in the year 2000, which is just I mean,
No,
come on,
that's,
dude. You think this swung 5 states?
No way. It was an interesting point because it feels like there was like a discussion around it about kind of conservative hypocrisy, which was I remember in 2000 a central tenet of what people described as Bush's appeal is he's the kind of guy you could have a beer with. And then when this came out, people were like, no, he doesn't drink beer anymore because of this. And so it became this like whole confusing narrative of like what people liked about him. He would be nice to drink a beer with versus what he's actually like when he drinks beer, which is gets behind the wheel of a car. And then it kind of canceled each other out.
Oh, man.
I do think Gore's decision to not hammer at this probably plays a big part in it, honestly. And I mean, frankly, in my mind, sort of parallels Gore's decision to not go too hard in the wake of the election. I think it was probably also the last time candidates felt like the high road was maybe the road to victory.
Yeah, for sure.
Al Gore hears about drunk driving, and he's just sickened by our dependence on fossil fuels.
All right.
That's an inconvenient truth.
Kellie, let's do it.
You had to give me
to.
like the biggest surprise of all of October, which happens October 7th. It is the Access Hollywood tapes with Billy Bush in conversation with Donald Trump. And, they're talking in the back of looks like an RV, or they're talking in the back of like a press bus. And Trump is pretty much gloating about what he would do with a pretty woman. Every time he sees a pretty woman, he says, you can do anything. When you're a star, they let you. You can do anything. You can grab them by the pussy. You can do anything. And of course, Billy Bush is cracking up when he says this. And it becomes a huge moment. That I have a lot of thoughts about because this was right before the second debate when he says this, the second debate between Hillary Clinton. And so people think that this is going to be Trump's downfall. Like, oh, this is it. This is gonna take him down. Trump himself, of course, brushes it off. He's like, oh, this is locker room talk. This is not to be taken seriously. And then he does something really shady, which is at the debate, he tries to bring the women to the debate that accused Bill Clinton of sexual assault and harassment. And they are not allowed to attend the debate. But the fact that he brought them there and brings them to a press conference, and Hillary Clinton's kind of appalled by all of this. And you would think that women would be like, you know what? He doesn't have my vote. But of course, overwhelmingly, women do vote for Trump. So surprise, but no surprise.
All right. Thoughts, memories? Sorry to take you back to October 2016.
I don't know if anyone here is old enough to remember October 2016. But
It's been like 2 decades since
I know,
then.
yeah.
So.
I had just long flowing hair like Bon Jovi in the 80s. But I that was a prevailing feeling, I think, in many corners of like, he can't recover from how grotesque this comes off.
Yeah.
And it was like, again, constant coverage. And it was really jarring. It was like everybody here I was being facetious, is old enough to remember like that feeling of like, oh, this is it. This is as big, I would say as big a scandal that happened, or a hot mic moment that had happened in a presidential election in my lifetime. And it happened 1 month before the election. And I didn't change the results.
No.
Well,
no, except for Billy Bush. I mean, Billy Bush loses his job.
yeah, poor Billy Bush.
The real victim in all of
He's
this.
going to be fine.
But
He's
no,
fine.
look, this is, NIki hinted at it earlier. When an election is really close, you can point to any host of things. I think there is a world in which you can. I mean, I was at 538 at the time. We were looking at the polling very closely, day by day. this did hurt Trump.
Yeah.
You know, and we're going to get to something else later that did hurt Trump. And, you know, Trump lost the popular vote.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, you can say this like had an effect. Obviously, you know, he wins, but you know, it's you kind of have to hold both thoughts that it didn't matter and it did.
But it didn't matter to me. I think it didn't matter to the group of people that it should have mattered to the most, which was white women. You know, there is that sort of instant, sort of offensive, pearl clutching moment. But yet when they go to the ballot box, you know, they all overwhelmingly check for Donald Trump. And so I think because of the way it got brushed under the rug, it's kind of like, oh, you know how boys talk. Oh, you know, the locker room. I mean, it really got trivialized and diminished and reduced in a way that it didn't, after a few weeks, I think, have that same sort of gravitas.
And in many ways, it made the party support for him even stronger because once they came home, they'd already come home and set aside some of the biggest, most offensive stuff. I remember when this tape dropped because I was getting on...
Dropped, like it's a...
I know.
I remember when he dropped this.
You're on Dat Piff downloading it.
Drop the visuals, Trump.
I was getting on a plane and this came out. And for the very first time, I bought Wi-Fi on a plane because I was like, what just happened? And also recall that same day, a few hours later, maybe a half hour later, WikiLeaks messages dropped.
Yeah.
And I recall those two things happening right back to back and didn't know at the time how determinative they would be of...
Yes. I mean, there was a lot going on.
There's a lot going on.
I want to speed up the pace here for time, but one last thing on this Access Hollywood tape was just the sort of behind the scenes. So Trump had, you know, there are all these rumors about The Apprentice and his behavior on The Apprentice that had come out, which caused an NBC reporter who had worked on Access Hollywood, you know, a decade earlier, to sort of remember this moment, dug it up in the archives. Apparently at NBC, they were kind of going through legal, doing the vetting, deciding kind of how to put this out. And that was taking like a number of days in early October. And someone then just leaked it to the Washington Post. And David Fahrenthold put it up on the Washington Post website. And then NBC freaks out. They put it on. And I think it was the most traffic the Washington Post website had ever gotten. It crashed their servers. And Fahrenthold won a Pulitzer Prize for posting. He did other good reporting too, but he won a Pulitzer Prize. TMZ, though, published a rumor that to your point earlier about kind of sitting on the news, that NBC had actually known about this for months, and they were conspiring to wait until the last moment and make it an October surprise. But NBC has denied that. All right, everyone, we are going to take a break here. That is the first half of our live conversation about October surprises. We'll be back with another episode on Thursday featuring the second half. We hope you are enjoying this. We really had a blast at the live show. By the way, while I have you, there were some other parts of that evening that we recorded, mostly Q&A with the audience and some other conversation that we're not going to put in the podcast feed, but we will drop the audio of that into our newsletter. So if you are not subscribed to our newsletter, go ahead and sign up. It's free. It comes out every week. Lots of interesting stuff in there. You can sign up for the newsletter at thisdaypod.com. And while you're there, you'll also find a link to our merch store where we just added pint glasses, which we debuted at our live show in Boston. We were all sipping out of them on stage. It's a pretty handsome pint glass, if I do say so myself. I designed it. Anyway, my name is Jody Avergan. On behalf of NIki and Kellie and Josh Gondelman and Brittany and Jacob and everyone else here, thanks for listening, and we will be back real soon.
Radiotopia.